everyone, another tutorial for you today. We're going to be creating a similar mini watercolor and soft pastel landscape, similar to what we did last time, but slightly varying in color and tone. We're going to be using the same cotton paper, one or two watercolors, and about 5 or 6 different soft pastels. So let's go through what we need and then we'll get started. So I always start with my favorite Rug and Weave incense sticks to set the mood. I like to set my piece of paper onto a white background, so I'm using a double-sided piece of tape, applying that to my surface, and then applying a piece of scrap paper that I like to use. On top of that, I'll then apply another piece of double-sided tape, and then apply our cotton piece that we're going to be painting onto. Just like that. Make sure that it's fastened so it doesn't move when we're working on it. In terms of the watercolor paint, I like to use Winsor Newton's Professional and the Cotman Series watercolor paints. In this particular piece, we're going to be using these two, Indigo and Sepia, combination of the two to set our underpainting. The brush I'm using is my favorite Princeton Neptune 18 round. You'll need a cloth and some clean water. Now, to establish sort of an inspiration piece, this is what I'm going to be working towards recreating. I really like the sort of brown, blue, and warm pink and yellow hues in this piece. So we're going to be using that to inspire what we're going to be doing today. In terms of the soft pastels, I'm going to be pulling out a few pieces of soft pastel, maybe 5 or 6, that reflect the pieces that I want to create in my landscape. So I'm picking some darker, sort of cool greens. My white happens to be in that same set, so I'm pulling that out for highlights. I'm also picking out some really soft, light purples. And then I want to complement that with like a peachy orange pink color, which goes really nice against those purple shades. Okay, in terms of our first step, watercolor, this is my palette. It's got some dried paint on it, which is fine. Already in this larger square here, I have my Sepia and my Indigo. So I'm just going to wet my brush and activate my paint and establish sort of a pool of a quite highly pigmented paint that I can apply to the base of my piece and then soften that in color value as I work my way up, adding more water. So here there's a little bit of violet, so I don't want that. So I'm going to actually pull some of the indigo, the dried indigo and the sepia that I have in my in the little squares I have next to it, and just keep adding until I achieve sort of a good amount of pigment and water, a nice pool that I can work from. My paintbrush is obviously quite large, so it picks up a lot of water and it picks up a lot of paint. So I want to make sure that I have sufficient amount. So taking that paint, using obviously a wet brush, I'm going to apply the highest color value to the bottom. And I want to work quickly here because this handmade cotton paper from Feathersandstone, it absorbs paint very quickly, and I don't want any marks on it. I want a very soft, gradual softening of the paint as I work up the page. So I'm working really quickly. I'm just dipping my brush into the water, dabbing some of the water off onto the cloth, and then moving that paint slowly up my sheet of paper. As you can see, making sure I'm getting all my edges, and then going back in, lifting paint off my paper, removing it on my cloth, and then going back in and creating sort of diagonal textural marks that I really like once they dry, and it creates a very natural sort of fading into what would be a floral field or a landscape. So I'm just going in as I'm continuing, adding a little bit more pigment to the very base of this piece, lifting paint, and just getting a really nice soft sort of landscape that you can see here close up as it's drying, it's really bleeding nicely together and creating a really smooth surface for me to work on. So once that's dry, you want to make sure it's absolutely dry. We don't want to be using soft pastels on a piece that is damp. We're going to remove all our watercolors. We're done with that part, and we're going to transition into the soft pastels. So I have my palette on the left and my inspiration piece on the right, and I'm going to start slowly with the darkest points of my piece. So these really sort of dark blue, green, browns, and I'm going to apply them in very soft sort of strokes that mimic the piece that I'm using as my inspiration. So I'm just looking, referencing back, and really very intuitively placing strokes where I want to create dark spots, where I want to create highlights, and where I ultimately want to create, let's say, clusters of flowers and leaves and highlights. So as I work through this piece, I'm going to be working with lighter and lighter pastels. So my lightest sort of points on the piece will be towards the end. And I do that once we start painting in the sky. I reference back to the base of the painting and create those highlights that way. So I'm sort of just using all my sort of dark brown, green, olive colors, placing these strokes very loosely, very intuitively on my piece. There really isn't a formula to this. It's really just very, very intuitive. So let your intuition guide you, and just place them as you feel rather than where you think they should go, or trying to create or establish any sort of symmetry here. Okay, so now I'm going to be using some of my mid-greens. I'm adding a few pieces that I didn't add in the beginning, some sort of really warm yellows, warm greens that I want to complement this piece as I go. So here I'm just adding sort of a cluster of green, this sort of medium olive green that I really like using. It complements both the blue and the peach color that we're going to be adding on top of that really nicely. And I'm adding a cluster sort of on center right of the piece, but I'm also diffusing that color outwards because I don't want sort of any hard transitions, right? Naturally in a landscape, you don't have hard lines. So everything that you sort of place and add, you want to soften as you move outward. So you'll notice, like, as I move up the piece, my strokes are a little bit smaller since those flowers are further away from you. And then I'm softening by using a side edge of my pastel and creating more softer brush strokes. So this part here, I'm noticing there's some blues and some sort of like light purple, gray purple color. So I'm adding that in right now in very, very soft, loose strokes. And that will also establish, as we go on, sort of a lighter point in the piece. I'm taking that same color and I'm working it up the page as it will slowly sort of transition into what will be our sky. So I want that color to be a really soft bleed between the base and the top of the painting. So I'm using this really nice light gray color. It has a blue tone to it, so it's on the cool side, but it looks really nice against the darker blues. So I'm adding that in, and I'm slowly starting to establish these lighter points on the piece. So I'm really liking how this piece of pastel is doing a really nice job bringing the top of the piece and the bottom of the piece together. It's sort of my transition color between the sky and the field of flowers. So now I'm going to go in with my soft pink and very lightly I'm going to use sort of the edge which I find leaves a bit more pigment, and start placing petals and flowers in and around one particular spot of the piece, but then diffusing and doing lighter, smaller strokes, working my way out to the edges of the paper. In this way, I'm starting to establish composition where I want the eye to go to this main cluster of flowers in a very soft way, and then using complementing colors, you're going to draw the eye outward. So I've just cleaned off my hands because I'm going to start working on the sky, and I want to use, I want to make sure that all my pastels are clean and I'm not leaving any marks of another tone on the sky. And the way that I like to start with the sky is I begin with this very cool gray, and I establish darker pieces on my clouds. I'm using a finger just to soften and lighten that color as I move up. So now that I've got my darker sort of shadows in the sky, I'm going to start using this lighter blue and creating, I would say, edges, like the edges of the clouds. And I'm doing that ever so gently, blending it in with the color I just used, but also creating some more pigmented areas that will then receive the lighter peach and white colors of the clouds on top of that. So with that same pink, you can use the same pink that you used in your flowers, but you could also, if you have another pink in your set, feel free to experiment. I'm going in and creating these warm pink corally colors that you often see at dusk or at dawn. And I find I just love this color in the sky, and I love it against the peachy color, and I love it against the yellow color that I'm picking up right now. And they work really well together. So I'm just brushing off my pastel because I noticed there was a little bit of pigment from another darker color, and I don't want that to leave a mark on the page. So I'm going in similar to where I had the pink, and I'm just bleeding and blending with my finger these three colors together to create a very soft effect. Okay, and lastly with my white, I'm going to clean off my pastel as well. And I'm going in and creating my highlights, these bright spots where what's left of the sky, the sun in the evening, or the sun coming up is peeking through a cluster of clouds. And what's important here is that I'm sort of establishing a connection to my field of flowers. So I'm bringing that white down, and as it peeks through the clouds, it's also going to create some highlights at the base of my painting as well. So I'm blending and bleeding and really softening these colors together in the sky. And as I work my way down, I'm going to, with a slightly harder press on the paper, create these really bright spots with my white. These are really soft pastels, so I find that not too much pressure gets you quite a lot of pigment on the page. So I'm using the edge of the pastel where I want a lot of the pigment to stay on the page. And I'm just softening sort of the horizon line here with the white color I thought was needed. And there it is. Here's a close-up of the piece. I'm just adding a few more highlights where I think is needed. And you can see that pigment on the page and varying densities and color value, which is really, really quite interesting, and which is what I love about the contrast between those watercolor and the soft pastel is there's a really soft and gradual underpainting, and then the soft pastel creates a lot of texture on the piece. So thank you for painting with me. I would love to see your pieces. Share them with me, and I look forward to our next tutorial. Thank you.